We are going to analyse the differences on the basis of two archetypical forms, the spontaneous live speech and carefully formed writing, such as in an essay or a letter. There are, of course, also intermediate forms, such as speaking like writing, for instance, a lecture being given without notes, and particularly important today, writing like speaking, such as a text message or a conversation in a chat room. However, before we go into these hybrid oral-written crossover forms, we want to disentangle the features that make the two modes significantly different. We are going to argue that these differences in meaning between the written and the oral modes are so significant that the two modes are typically used to mean different things.
What I want to do now is I want to take our 5 questions about meaning, our 5 dimensions in a grammar of multimodality, and I want to apply that to the world of orality. So what we have is we refer to things, and we can either refer to particular things, something that I'm talking about. It might be a question, it might be a statement, whatever it is. And what I can do is I can use a kind of speaking, like questioning, which is kind of a conceptual version of what I do in the world of speaking. My speech has all sorts of characteristics which have semantic loading, stresses and pauses and all those kinds of things. And that those characteristics they refer to something, or I'm meaning to refer to something in that act of exercising oral language in these particular ways. And it might establish relationships within the oral text, pausing as a contrast, or pausing because I'm going to change the subject, like I am now, for example. So in other words, there are structural relations in the way in which I build this oral discourse. Now, so that's the first question, that business of referring, to refer. The second question about meaning is to dialogue. So how are people positioned? And in speech, this is pretty clear, to be quite frank. There are speakers, here, me, and there are listeners, you, and that the configuration of people happens in speech itself as an action, as a form of human activity. And also what happens is there are different kinds of utterance which are marked by prosody, which are marked by sound. Statements, questions, commands, and so on. So I can say, you're going today, or I can say, you're going today, or I can say, you're going today. Right. So in other words, the intonation there tells you what it is that I'm meaning to say, even though the words are identical grammatically and structurally. The meanings are actually very, very different, and that's marked in prosody. Now, in fact, we can mark it in prosody, and we do mark that prosody in language with punctuation, but as I said before, it's pretty crude and it's pretty simple. How emphatic was the order? How definite was the statement? How insistent was the question? That's very hard to represent in written language, but it's something which we classically do in this dialogue, the relationship of persons to persons in oral language. Now, oral language is structured. We have phrasing, we have tone, we have stress, we have rhythm, we have timbre, we have pauses. Interestingly, Gunter Kress has this notion of there aren't phrases or clauses, and certainly not sentences, and certainly not paragraphs in writing. What we have are these kind of information units which cluster and follow each other one after the other. It's not structured grammatically in the same way that written language is. It's very, very different in a whole lot of ways. Now, it's also situated, number 4. Where is the speaker? What is their context? And how is it like or unlike other ways of speaking, which might be accent, it might be dialect, there might be all kinds of, or it might be angry speech or loving speech or a whole range of things. In other words, speech types can be defined by their likeness or unlikeness to other speech types. And then finally, to intend, what are the purposes in my speaking, which might be sarcasm, it might be anger, it might be inquisitiveness, right? So, and the speaking, the sounds of the speech carry those senses, not just the words themselves. And then you might hear things differently. You might think, I don't think I'm being aggressive, but you think it's really aggressive. So there are interests in the hearing as well. So in other words, and these are both like and unlike interests in all the other modes, but the way in which they're represented in speech is in terms of these characteristic forms of this mode of orality. I want to talk about now a number of paths to synesthesia. So I've done this kind of caricature, if you like, or not so much caricature, but a kind of a paradigmatic contrast between writing in its absolutely distinctive forms and speaking in its absolutely distinctive forms. What makes this whole area complicated and interesting is not just that you move between one form and another, which is synesthesia, but there are a whole lot of intermediate forms while you're on the way moving from one form to the other. So what we do is sometimes some of the best writers capture beautifully some aspects of oral language. Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn would have to be a lovely example of something which captures the vernacular of the people with whom Mark Twain himself associated with when he was on Mississippi riverboats, and then he captures that beautifully in the novel. Now, in fact, the truth is he could never really capture exactly what it was, because language can't ever capture that orality perfectly and completely. And by the way, perhaps if he did capture it completely or captured it even more accurately, it'd be even harder for us to understand because it's further away from our experience. So, but the only point is direct speech written down is an attempt to capture orality in a way which is different from writing. So it's one of these kind of middle ground spaces. Another interesting middle ground space is today's participatory social media. So the question is a text message speaking or writing? Well, it's kind of a little, grammatically, it's a little bit of both and it's a little bit of neither. Is a Facebook interchange, a Facebook post followed by comments and likes and all that kind of stuff, is that more like speaking or more like writing? It's actually an intermediate kind of space in some interesting kinds of ways, a hybrid space which has characteristics of both modes. And by that I mean grammatical, structural, vocab, similar, there are things that go both ways in terms of the way in which those kinds of new media, participatory social media operate. But what there is also is a world of people who are perhaps highly educated, perhaps people who've learned professional discourses in an elaborate kind of way, who speak like writing. So two lawyers speaking to each other about a case would probably speak in speech which is like writing, okay? In a way, even though I don't have any notes and I'm not reading this, some of this is closer to speaking like writing than the conversation I would have about my family in a cafe, okay? So in other words, there are these intermediate spaces where we import the grammar of writing into speech, and in the same way that in a novel we might try to import the grammar of speech into the novel in order to capture the flavour of the interchange. So we have all these kind of intermediate spaces as well.
There are profound educational reasons why we would want to bring the oral and the oral written mode shifting back into literacies, and these are connected with our concept of synesthesia. Mode shifting can be used as a strategy for learning. We can mean a house in a mental image. We can mean it in a written description. We may ask a learner to draw the house, then write a description of the house. All these meanings refer to the same thing, but in a completely different way. They end up as different meanings about the same thing. So it is with speaking and writing. We may, as a student, want to talk about a house and then write about it. The oral and the written texts are as different from each other as the visual and the written. However, the mode shifting will have been helpful to learning. Meaning the house through one mode helps us form the meaning in the other. It also adds something to the developing overall multimodal meaning of the house.